And I suppose the way that we can bring anarchism and Marxism together in that respect is that, you know, when I began to write that book, I was writing about a movement that was one that included a number of young people, men and women, who mostly in prison came to have a new kind of a consciousness about what their political movement was, and who saw themselves pretty much as Marxists. And they were reading Che Guevara, and they were reading, you know, the great sort of iconic books of the time, and becoming basically self-produced Marxist armed guerrillas in jail with the thought that they would go back out into the street. And I was kind of writing this book as such. It was only really after the book was written and we began to discuss it, and in fact Stoughton and Andrej and some other people took it into the prison, and it became a sort of a center of discussion within the prison, because they saw these kind of parallels between what was happening in Ireland and what is happening in some of the prisons here. And there's also some very important differences. It was only then that I began to think about the degree to which what was going on was also anarchism. And I think it was really Andrej in a conversation that we had, which wound up being published in ZMag and ZNet, that this really came out. And what it had to do with was the degree to which the prisoners, while they were sort of talking about taking state power, and they were talking about how they would create a new society, and they were talking about how armed struggle would overthrow the British government, and they would have United Ireland, and then they would begin to create some kind of new society within that United Ireland. While they were doing that, in the jail they were actually creating this prefigurative society that Andrej mentioned. They were, in fact, creating an alternative community. Bobby Sands himself said to some of the other prisoners, you know, this is the closest to communism that we'll ever get. And they, in very isolated and very bare conditions of one of the worst prison regimes in modern history, begin to sort of organize this kind of society. They also talked about, and in some cases practiced, doing this on the outside whenever they got out of jail. But this was a period when very few people got out of jail for very long, because they wound up back in due to the various kinds of interrogation and you know, trial without jury system that was going on in Ireland at the time. So as we discussed this and looked more at it, we began to think about the degree to which this really was a real example of, you know, people who thought they were doing Marxism, but at the same time I guess they were doing anarchism, to put it in a kind of simplistic sort of way. And so we continued that conversation in Wobblies and Zapatistas. Now, more recently, just to get a little bit political economic, which I know Andrej hates, I've been teaching a course on social theory, and one thing that we've been doing in this course is combining reading Capital, the Volume 1, Karl Polanyi, Great Transformation, but more importantly, the stuff from Trade and Market in Early Empires, which is about substantive economy and non-formal economy, and Kropotkin, Mutual Aid. And reading these things together really has been a real eye-opener, I think, for us in terms of the way in which Marxism and anarchism fit together. You know, I'm still very impressed and just blown away by what Marx is doing in Volume 1 of Capital. Once you get past all this, how many ways can you say that 20 yards of linen equals a coat? Once you get past that, you know, the abstraction that he's up to is really a very amazing thing, and it still reveals an awful lot about what is going on, and particularly about the special nature of labor as a commodity and the importance of that for the way in which social relations are carried out under capitalism. But you know, when we read that abstraction together with Polanyi on the one hand and Kropotkin, it just becomes very stark the degree to which the abstraction takes us away from this whole other world which is going on at the same time, and which has some kind of connection with the ideal type of capitalism that Marx is talking about. So Polanyi, for example, talks about formal and substantive economy, and he talks about the degree to which many of the things that we do take place outside of the capitalist system. They or outside of the formal market system. And that as people provision themselves within communities, as they household, as they're involved in other kinds of activities that are market activities, but redistribution and reciprocity and so on and so forth, you know, they are in fact continually creating and recreating and reproducing a system that is part of capitalism but not part of it at the same time. And it's a system where many of the things that we do and continue to do to reproduce ourselves is both a form of resistance, as James Scott and some other people would claim, but also a form of creativity and a form of prefigurative activity. And I think we lose sight of, by looking at capitalism as a formal system and a formal economy, we lose sight of the degree to which we continually do these kinds of things in our day-to-day life. And sometimes they become something more than that. So, you know, particularly when we think about the prisoners and the things that they were doing, or if we think about the Zapatistas, or if we think even about, you know, guerrilla movements in isolated places, we see how this kind of doing of other things becomes something more than simply kind of creating. Like Desartu in his book Practices of Everyday Life talks about how when we cook, when we dance, you know, we are in fact resisting. Well, you know, maybe that's true to an extent, but you know, we certainly have to go far beyond that in order to make the acts of cooking and dancing and other things be truly revolutionary. So this is a thing that, you know, I've been thinking about, and we were talking about in the class, and that we've talked about in our conversations. Che, you know, when he was in the Sierra Maestra, one of the most exciting things that he did, if you read the reminiscences, is he set up a bread factory. You know, they had the radio station. They were doing all of these kinds of things that really were quite prefigurative, even if later on the movement became something very different. The same thing is true of the Irish struggle. They were doing something very prefigurative at the time, even if later on that became a sort of a transition to a peace process and electoral politics and all of the kinds of things that Andrej was bemoaning earlier on. The other part of that, I guess, is remembering Kropotkin and the way in which he reminds us throughout the book Mutual Aid that this drive to become involved in solidarity continually comes back and continually comes back as various state forces and other powerful forces try and repress it. And even, you know, as the ideology of possessive individualism and the market and so on becomes predominant and hegemonic, there still continually is this reemergence of solidarity and of activity that is based around solidarity and around mutual aid.